Book 2, Part 5 of Herodotus's Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Histories, Volume 1 by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, translated by A. D. Godley. Book 2, Part 5, paragraphs 93 to 115. Fish that go in schools are seldom born in rivers. They are raised in the lakes, and this is how they behave. When the desire of spawning comes on them, they swim out to sea in schools, the males leading, and throwing out their milt, while the females come after and swallow and conceive from it. When the females have grown heavy in the sea, then all the fish swim back to their own haunts. But the same no longer lead. Now the leadership goes to the females. They go before in a school, as the males had, and now and then throw off some of their eggs, which are like millet seeds, which the males devour as they follow. These millet seeds or eggs are fish. The fish that are reared come from the eggs that survive and are not devoured. Those fish that are caught while swimming seawards show bruises on the left side of their heads, those that are caught returning on the right side. This happens because they keep close to the left bank as they swim seawards, and keep to the same bank also on their return, grazing it and keeping in contact with it as well as they can, I suppose lest the current make them miss their way. When the Nile begins to rise, hollow and marshy places near the river are the first to begin to fill, the water trickling through from the river, and as soon as they are flooded they are suddenly full of little fishes. Where these probably come from, I believe that I can guess. When the Nile falls, the fish have dropped their eggs into the mud before they leave with the last of the water, and when in the course of time the flood comes again in the following year, from these eggs at once come the fish. So much then for the fish. The Egyptians who live around the marshes use an oil drawn from the castor berry, which they call kiki. They sow this plant, which grows wild in Hellas, on the banks of the rivers and lakes. Sown in Egypt, it produces abundant fruit, though malodorous. When they gather this, some bruise and press it, others boil after roasting it, and collect the liquid that comes from it. This is thick and useful as oil for lamps, and gives off a strong smell. Against the mosquitoes that abound, the following have been devised by them. Those who dwell higher up than the marshy country are well served by the towers where they ascend to sleep, for the winds prevent the mosquitoes from flying aloft. Those living about the marshes have a different recourse instead of the towers. Every one of them has a net, with which he catches fish by day, and at night he sets it round the bed where he rests, then creeps under it and sleeps. If he sleeps wrapped in a garment or cloth, the mosquitoes bite through it, but through the net they absolutely do not even venture. The boats in which they carry cargo are made of the acacia, which is most like the lotus of Cyrene in form, and its sap is gum. Of this tree they cut logs of 4 feet long, and lay them like courses of bricks, and build the boat by fastening these 4-foot logs to long and close set stakes, and having done so, they set cross beams athwart and on the logs. They use no ribs. They caulk the seams within with biblus. There is one rudder passing through a hole in the boat's keel. The mast is of acacia wood, and the sails of biblus. These boats cannot move upstream unless a brisk breeze continues. They are towed from the bank, but downstream they are managed thus. They have a raft made of tamarisk wood, fastened together with matting of reeds, and a pierced stone of about 2 talents weight. The raft is let go to float down ahead of the boat, connected to it by a rope, and the stone is connected by a rope to the after part of the boat. So, driven by the current, The raft floats swiftly and tows the baris, which is the name of these boats, and the stone dragging behind on the river bottom keeps the boat's course straight. There are many of these boats. Some are of many thousand talents burden. When the Nile overflows the land, only the towns are seen high and dry above the water, very like the islands in the Aegean Sea. These alone stand out, the rest of Egypt being a sheet of water. So, when this happens, folk are not ferried, as usual, in the course of the stream, but clean over the plain. Indeed, the boat going up from Naucratis to Memphis passes close by the pyramids themselves, though the course does not go by here, but by the Delta's point and the town Kerkasaurus. But your voyage from the sea and Cannabus to Naucratis will take you over the plain near the town of Anthilla, and that which is called Arcandrus's town. Anthilla is a town of some reputation, and is especially assigned to the consort of the reigning king of Egypt, to provide her shoes. This has been done since Egypt has been under Persian dominion. The other town, I think, is named after Arcandrus, son of Phthius the Achaean, and son-in-law of Danaus, for it is called Arcandrus's town. It may be that there was another Arcandrus, but the name is not Egyptian. So far, all I have said is the record of my own autopsy and judgment and inquiry. Henceforth I will record Egyptian chronicles according to what I have heard, adding something of what I myself have seen. The priests told me that Min was the first king of Egypt, and that first he separated Memphis from the Nile by a dam. All the river had flowed close under the sandy mountains on the Libyan side, but Min made the southern bend of it, which begins about 12½ miles above Memphis, by damming the stream, thereby drying up the ancient channel, and carried the river by a channel so that it flowed midway between the hills. And to this day the Persians keep careful watch on this bend of the river, strengthening its dam every year to keep the current in, for were the Nile to burst its dikes and overflow here, all Memphis would be in danger of flooding. Then, when this first king Min had made dry land of what he thus cut off, he first founded in it that city which is now called Memphis, for even Memphis lies in the narrow part of Egypt, and outside of it he dug a lake from the river to its north and west, for the Nile itself bounds it on the east, and secondly he built in it the great and most noteworthy temple of Hephaestus. After him came 330 kings, whose names the priests recited from a papyrus roll. In all these many generations there were 18 Ethiopian kings, and one queen, native to the country; the rest were all Egyptian men. The name of the queen was the same as that of the Babylonian princess Nitocris. She, to avenge her brother (he was king of Egypt, and was slain by his subjects, who then gave Nitocris the sovereignty), put many of the Egyptians to death by treachery. She built a spacious underground chamber. Then, with the pretence of inaugurating it, but with quite another intent in her mind, she gave a great feast, inviting to it those Egyptians whom she knew to have had the most complicity in her brother's murder. And while they feasted, she let the river in upon them by a vast secret channel. This was all that the priests told of her, except that when she had done this, she cast herself into a chamber full of hot ashes, to escape vengeance. But of the other kings they related no achievement or act of great note, except of Moiris, the last of them. This Moiris was remembered as having built the northern forecourt of the temple of Hephaestus, and dug a lake, of as great a circumference as I shall later indicate, and built pyramids there also, the size of which I will mention when I speak of the lake. All this was Moiris's work, they said; of none of the rest had they anything to record. Leaving the latter aside, then, I shall speak of the king who came after them, whose name was Sesostris. This king, the priests said, set out with a fleet of long ships from the Arabian Gulf, and subjugated all those living by the Red Sea, until he came to a sea which was too shallow for his vessels. After returning from there back to Egypt, he gathered a great army, according to the account of the priests, and marched over the mainland, subjugating every nation to which he came. When those that he met were valiant men and strove hard for freedom, he set up pillars in their land, the inscription on which showed his own name and his country's, and how he had overcome them with his own power. But when the cities had made no resistance, and had been easily taken, then he put an inscription on the pillars, just as he had done where the nations were brave, but he also drew on them the private parts of a woman, wishing to show clearly that the people were cowardly. He marched over the country, doing this until he had crossed over from Asia to Europe, and defeated the Scythians and Thracians. Thus far and no farther, I think, the Egyptian army went, for the pillars can be seen standing in their country, but in none beyond it. From there he turned around and went back home, and when he came to the Phasis river, that king, Sesostris, may have detached some part of his army and left it there to live in the country, for I cannot speak with exact knowledge; or it may be that some of his soldiers grew weary of his wanderings, and stayed by the Phasis. For it is plain to see that the Colchians are Egyptians, and what I say I myself noted before I heard it from others. When it occurred to me, I inquired of both peoples, and the Colchians remembered the Egyptians better than the Egyptians remembered the Colchians. The Egyptians said that they considered the Colchians part of Sesostris's army. I myself guessed it, partly because they are dark skinned and woolly haired, though that indeed counts for nothing, since other peoples are too. But my better proof was that the Colchians and the Egyptians and Ethiopians are the only nations that have from the first practised circumcision. The Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine acknowledge that they learnt the custom from the Egyptians, and the Syrians of the valleys of Thermodon and the Parthenius, as well as their neighbours the Macrones, say that they learnt it lately from the Colchians. These are the only nations that circumcise, and it is seen that they do just as the Egyptians. But as to the Egyptians and Ethiopians themselves, I cannot say which nation learnt it from the other, for it is evidently a very ancient custom. That the others learnt it through traffic with Egypt, I consider clearly proved by this, that Phoenicians who traffic with Hellas cease to imitate the Egyptians in this matter, and do not circumcise their children. Listen to something else about the Colchians, in which they are like the Egyptians. They and the Egyptians alone work linen, and have the same way of working it, a way peculiar to themselves, and they are alike in all their way of life and in their speech. Linen has two names. The Colchian kind is called by the Greeks Sardonian. That which comes from Egypt is called Egyptian. As to the pillars that Sesostris, king of Egypt, set up in the countries, most of them are no longer to be seen. But I myself saw them in the Palestine district of Syria, with the aforesaid writing and the women's private parts on them. Also there are in Ionia two figures of this man carved in rock, one on the road from Ephesus to Phocaea, and the other on that from Sardis to Smyrna. In both places the figure is over 20 feet high, with a spear in his right hand and a bow in his left, and the rest of his equipment proportional, for it is both Egyptian and Ethiopian, and right across the breast from one shoulder to the other a text is cut in the Egyptian sacred characters, saying, "I myself won this land with the strength of my shoulders." There is nothing here to show who he is and whence he comes, but it is shown elsewhere. Some of those who have seen these figures guess they are Memnon, but they are far indeed from the truth. Now when this Egyptian Sesostris, so the priests said, reached Daphnae of Pelusium on his way home, leading many captives from the peoples whose lands he had subjugated, his brother, whom he had left in charge in Egypt, invited him and his sons to a banquet, and then piled wood around the house and set it on fire. When Sesostris was aware of this, he at once consulted his wife, whom, it was said, he had with him, and she advised him to lay two of his 6 sons on the fire and make a bridge over the burning, so that they could walk over the bodies of the two and escape. This Sesostris did. 2 of his sons were thus burnt, but the rest escaped alive with their father. After returning to Egypt and avenging himself on his brother, Sesostris found work for the multitude which he brought with him from the countries which he had subdued. It was these who dragged the great and long blocks of stone which were brought in this king's reign to the temple of Hephaestus, and it was they who were compelled to dig all the canals which are now in Egypt, and involuntarily made what had been a land of horses and carts empty of these. For from this time Egypt, although a level land, could use no horses or carts, because there were so many canals going every which way. The reason why the king thus intersected the country was this. Those Egyptians whose towns were not on the Nile, but inland from it, lacked water whenever the flood left their land, and drank only brackish water from wells. For this reason Egypt was intersected. The king also, they said, divided the country among all the Egyptians by giving each an equal parcel of land, and made this his source of revenue, assessing the payment of a yearly tax. And any man who was robbed by the river of part of his land could come to Sesostris and declare what had happened. Then the king would send men to look into it and calculate the part by which the land was diminished, so that thereafter it should pay in proportion to the tax originally imposed. From this, in my opinion, the Greeks learnt the art of measuring land. The sun clock and the sundial and the 12 divisions of the day came to Hellas from Babylonia, and not from Egypt. Sesostris was the only Egyptian king who also ruled Ethiopia. To commemorate his name he set before the temple of Hephaestus 2 stone statues of himself and of his wife, each 50 feet high, and statues of his 4 sons, each 33 feet. Long afterwards Darius the Persian would have set up his statue before these, but the priest of Hephaestus forbade him, saying that he had achieved nothing equal to the deeds of Sesostris the Egyptian. For Sesostris, he said, had subjugated the Scythians, besides as many nations as Darius had conquered, and Darius had not been able to overcome the Scythians. Therefore it was not just that Darius should set his statue before the statues of Sesostris, whose achievements he had not equalled. Darius, it is said, let the priest have his way. When Sesostris died, he was succeeded in the kingship, the priests said, by his son Pheros. This king waged no wars, and chanced to become blind, for the following reason. The Nile came down in such a flood as there had never been, rising to a height of 30 feet, and the water that flowed over the fields was roughened by a strong wind. Then, it is said, the king was so audacious as to seize a spear and hurl it into the midst of the river eddies. Right after this he came down with a disease of the eyes, and became blind. When he had been blind for 10 years, an oracle from the city of Buto declared to him that the term of his punishment was drawing to an end, and that he would regain his sight by washing his eyes with the urine of a woman who had never had intercourse with any man but her own husband. Pheros tried his own wife first, and as he remained blind, all women, one after another. When he at last recovers his sight, he took all the women who he had tried, except the one who had made him see again, and gathered them into one town, the one which is now called Red Clay. Having concentrated them together there, he burnt them and the town. But the woman by whose means he had recovered his sight he married. Most worthy of mention, among the many offerings which he dedicated in all the noteworthy temples for his deliverance from blindness, are the 2 marvellous stone obelisks which he set up in the Temple of the Sun. Each of these is made of a single block, and is over 166 feet high and 13 feet thick. Pheros was succeeded, they said, by a man of Memphis, whose name in the Greek tongue was Proteus. This Proteus has a very attractive and well appointed temple precinct at Memphis, south of the temple of Hephaestus. Around the precinct live Phoenicians of Tyre, and the whole place is called the Camp of the Tyrians. There is in the precinct of Proteus a temple called the Temple of the Stranger Aphrodite. I guess this is a temple of Helen, daughter of Tyndarus, partly because I have heard the story of Helen's abiding with Proteus, and partly because it bears the name of the foreign Aphrodite, for no other of Aphrodite's temples is called by that name. When I inquired of the priests, they told me that this was the story of Helen. After carrying off Helen from Sparta, Alexandrus sailed away for his own country. Violent winds caught him in the Aegean and drove him into the Egyptian sea, and from there, as the wind did not let up, he came to Egypt, to the mouth of the Nile, called the Canopic mouth, and to the Salters. Now there was, and still is, on the coast a temple of Heracles. If a servant of any man takes refuge there, and is branded with certain sacred marks, delivering himself to the god, he may not be touched. This law continues to-day the same as it has always been from the first. Hearing of the temple law, some of Alexandrus's servants ran away from him, threw themselves on the mercy of the god, and brought an accusation against Alexandrus, meaning to injure him, telling the whole story of Helen and the wrong done Menelaus. They laid this accusation before the priests and the warden of the Nile mouth, whose name was Thonis. When Thonis heard it, he sent this message the quickest way to Proteus at Memphis. A stranger has come, a Trojan, who has committed an impiety in Hellas. After defrauding his guest friend, he has come bringing the man's wife and a very great deal of wealth, driven to your country by the wind. Are we to let him sail away untouched, or are we to take away what he has come with? Proteus sent back this message. Whoever this is who has acted impiously against his guest friend, seize him and bring him to me, that I may know what he will say. Hearing this, Thonis seized Alexandrus, and detained his ships there, and then brought him with Helen and all the wealth, and the suppliants too, to Memphis. When all had arrived, Proteus asked Alexandrus who he was, and whence he sailed. Alexandrus told him his lineage and the name of his country, and about his voyage, whence he sailed. Then Proteus asked him where he had got Helen. When Alexandrus was evasive in his story and did not tell the truth, the men who had taken refuge with the temple confuted him, and related the whole story of the wrong. Finally Proteus declared the following judgment to them, saying, "If I did not make it a point never to kill a stranger who has been caught by the wind and driven to my coasts, I would have punished you on behalf of the Greek, you most vile man. You committed the gravest impiety after you had had your guest friend's hospitality. You had your guest friend's wife, and as if this were not enough, you got her to fly with you and went off with her. And not just with her either, but you plundered your guest friend's wealth, and brought it too. Now, then, since I make it a point not to kill strangers, I shall not let you take away this woman and the wealth, but I shall watch them for the Greek stranger, until he come and take them away. But as for you and your sailors, I warn you to leave my country for another within 3 days, and if you do not, I will declare war on you." End of Book 2, Part 5. Book 2, Part 6 of Herodotus's Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Histories, Volume 1, by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Translated by A. D. Godley. Book 2, Part 6. Paragraphs 116 to 133. This, the priests said, was how Helen came to Proteus. And in my opinion Homer knew this story too, but seeing that it was not so well suited to epic poetry as the tale of which he made use, he rejected it, showing that he knew it. This is apparent from the passage in the Iliad, and nowhere else does he return to the story, where he relates the wanderings of Alexander, and shows how he and Helen were carried off course, and wandered to, among other places, Sidon in Phoenicia. This is in the story of the prowess of Diomedes, where the verses run as follows: They were the robes all embroidered, the work of women of Sidon, whom godlike Alexandrus himself brought from Sidon, crossing the broad sea, the same voyage on which he brought back Helen of noble descent. He mentions it in the Odyssey also. The daughter of Zeus had such ingenious drugs, good ones, which she had from Thon's wife, Polydamna, an Egyptian, whose country's fertile plains bear the most drugs, many mixed for good, many for harm. And again Menelaus says to Telemachus, I was eager to return here, but the gods still held me in Egypt, since I had not sacrificed entire hecatombs to them. In these verses the poet shows that he knew of Alexander's wanderings to Egypt, for Syria borders on Egypt, and the Phoenicians, to whom Sidon belongs, dwell in Syria. These verses and this passage prove most clearly that the Cyprian poems are not the work of Homer, but of someone else, for the Cyprian poems relate that Alexandrus reached Ilion with Helen in 3 days from Sparta, having a fair wind and a smooth sea, but according to the Iliad he wandered from his course in bringing her. Enough, then, of Homer and the Cyprian poems. But when I asked the priests whether the Greek account of what happened at Troy were idle or not, they gave me the following answer, saying that they had inquired and knew from Menelaus himself. After the rape of Helen, a great force of Greeks came to the Trojan land on Menelaus's behalf. After disembarking and disposing their forces, they sent messengers to Ilion, one of whom was Menelaus himself. When these were let inside the city walls, they demanded the restitution of Helen and of the property which Alexandrus had stolen from Menelaus and carried off, and they demanded reparation for the wrongs. But the Trojans gave the same testimony then and later, sworn and unsworn, that they did not have Helen or the property claimed, but all of that was in Egypt, and they could not justly make reparation for what Proteus the Egyptian had. But the Greeks, thinking that the Trojans were mocking them, laid siege to the city until they took it. But there was no Helen there when they breached the wall, but they heard the same account as before. So, crediting the original testimony, they sent Menelaus himself to Proteus. Menelaus then went to Egypt and up the river to Memphis. There, relating the truth of the matter, he met with great hospitality and got back Helen, who had not been harmed, and also all his wealth besides. Yet, although getting this, Menelaus was guilty of injustice towards the Egyptians, for adverse weather detained him when he tried to sail away. After this continued for some time, he carried out something impious, taking 2 native children and sacrificing them. When it became known that he had done this, he fled with his ships straight to Libya, hated and hunted, and where he went from there the Egyptians could not say. The priests told me that they had learnt some of this by inquiry, but that they were sure of what had happened in their own country. The Egyptians' priests said this, and I myself believe their story about Helen, for I reasoned thus: had Helen been in Ilion, then with or without the will of Alexandrus, she would have been given back to the Greeks. For surely Priam was not so mad, or those nearest to him, as to consent to risk their own persons and their children and their city so that Alexandrus might cohabit with Helen. Even if it were conceded that they were so inclined in the first days, Yet when not only many of the Trojans were slain in fighting against the Greeks, but Priam himself lost to death 2 or 3 or even more of his sons in every battle, if the poets are to be believed, in this turn of events, had Helen been Priam's own wife, I cannot but think that he would have restored her to the Greeks, if by so doing he could escape from the evils besetting him. Alexandrus was not even heir to the throne, in which case matters might have been in his hands, since Priam was old; but Hector, who was an older and a better man than Alexandrus, was going to receive the royal power at Priam's death, and ought not to have acquiesced in his brother's wrongdoing, especially when that brother was the cause of great calamity to Hector himself and all the rest of the Trojans. But since they did not have Helen there to give back, and since the Greeks would not believe them, although they spoke the truth, I am convinced and declare the divine powers provided that the Trojans, perishing in utter destruction, should make this clear to all mankind, that retribution from the gods for terrible wrongdoing is also terrible. This is what I think, and I state it. The next to reign after Proteus, they said, was Rhampsinitus. The memorial of his name left by him was the western forecourt of the temple of Hephaestus. He set 2 statues here 41 feet high. The northernmost of these the Egyptians call Summer, and the southernmost Winter. The one that they call Summer they worship and treat well, but do the opposite to the statue called Winter. This king, they told me, had great wealth in silver, so great that none of the succeeding kings could surpass or come near it. To store his treasure safely he had a stone chamber built, one of its walls abutting on the outer side of his palace. But the builder of it shrewdly provided that one stone should be so placed as to be easily removed by 2 men, or even by one. So when the chamber was finished, the king stored his treasure in it, and as time went on, the builder, drawing near the end of his life, summoned his sons, he had 2, and told them how he had provided for them, that they have an ample livelihood, by the art with which he had built the king's treasure house. Explaining clearly to them how to remove the stone, he gave the coordinates of it, and told them that if they kept these in mind, they would be the custodians of the king's riches. So when he was dead, his sons got to work at once. Coming to the palace by night, they readily found and managed the stone in the building, and took away much of the treasure. When the king opened the building, he was amazed to see the containers lacking their treasure, yet he did not know whom to accuse, seeing that the seals were unbroken and the building shut fast. But when less treasure appeared the second and third times he opened the building, for the thieves did not stop plundering, he had traps made and placed around the containers in which his riches were stored. The thieves came just as before, and one of them crept in. When he came near the container, right away he was caught in the trap. When he saw the trouble he was in, he called to his brother right away, and explained to him the problem, and told him to come in quickly and cut off his head, lest he be seen and recognised, and destroy him too. He seemed to have spoken rightly to the other, who did as he was persuaded, and then, replacing the stone, went home, carrying his brother's head. When day came, the king went to the building, and was amazed to see in the trap the thief's body without a head, yet the building intact, with no way in or out. At a loss, he did as follows. He suspended the thief's body from the wall, and set guards over it, instructing them to seize and bring to him any whom they saw weeping or making lamentation. But the thief's mother, when the body had been hung up, was terribly stricken. She had words with her surviving son, and told him that he was somehow to think of some way to cut loose and bring her his brother's body, and if he did not obey, she threatened to go to the king and denounce him as having the treasure. So, when his mother bitterly reproached the surviving son, and for all that he said he could not dissuade her, he devised a plan. He harnessed asses, and put skins full of wine on the asses, then set out driving them, and when he was near those who were guarding the hanging body, he pulled at the feet of two or three of the skins and loosed their fastenings, and as the wine ran out he beat his head and cried aloud, like one who did not know to which ass he should turn first, while the guards, when they saw the wine flowing freely, ran out into the road with cups and caught what was pouring out, thinking themselves in luck. Feigning anger, the man cursed all, but as the guards addressed him peaceably, he pretended to be soothed and to relent in his anger, and finally drove his asses out of the road and put his harness in order. And after more words passed, and one joked with him and got him to laugh, he gave them one of the skins, and they lay down there just as they were, disposed to drink, and included him, and told him to stay and drink with them, and he consented and stayed. When they cheerily saluted him in their drinking, he gave them yet another of the skins, and the guards grew very drunk with the abundance of liquor, and lay down right there where they were drinking, overpowered by sleep. But he, when it was late at night, cut down the body of his brother, and shaved the right cheek of each of the guards for the indignity, and loading the body on his asses, drove home, fulfilling his mother's commands. When the king learnt that the body of the thief had been taken, he was beside himself, and, obsessed with finding out who it was who had managed this, did as follows, they say, but I do not believe it. He put his own daughter in a brothel, instructing her to accept all alike, and before having intercourse to make each tell her the shrewdest and most impious thing he had done in his life. Whoever told her the story of the thief she was to seize and not let go. The girl did as her father told her, and the thief, learning why she was doing this, did as follows, wanting to get the better of the king by craft. He cut the arm off a fresh corpse at the shoulder, and went to the king's daughter carrying it under his cloak, and when asked the same question as the rest, he said that his most impious act had been when he had cut the head off his brother who was caught in a trap in the king's treasury, and his shrewdest, that after making the guards drunk he had cut down his brother's hanging body. When she heard this the princess grabbed for him, but in the darkness the thief let her have the arm of the corpse, and clutching it she held on, believing that she had the arm of the other. But the thief, after giving it to her, was gone in a flash out of the door. When this also came to the king's ears, he was astonished at the man's ingenuity and daring, and in the end he sent a proclamation to every town, promising the thief immunity and a great reward if he would come into the king's presence. The thief trusted the king and came before him. Rhampsinitus was very admiring, and gave him his daughter to marry on the grounds that he was the cleverest of men. For, as the Egyptians, he said, surpassed all others in craft, so he surpassed the Egyptians. They said that later this king went down alive to what the Greeks call Hades, and there played dice with Demeter, and after winning some and losing some, came back with a gift from her of a golden hand towel. From the descent of Rhampsinitus, when he came back, they said that the Egyptians celebrate a festival, which I know that they celebrate to this day, but whether this is why they celebrate I cannot say. On the day of the festival the priests weave a cloth and bind it as a headband on the eyes of one of their number, whom they then lead, wearing the cloth, into a road that goes to the temple of Demeter. They themselves go back, but this priest, with his eyes bandaged, is guided, they say, by two wolves to Demeter's temple, a distance of 3 miles from the city, and led back again from the temple by the wolves to the same place. These Egyptian stories are for the benefit of whoever believes such tales. My rule in this history is that I record what is said by all as I have heard it. The Egyptians say that Demeter and Dionysus are the rulers of the lower world. The Egyptians were the first who maintained the following doctrine too, that the human soul is immortal, and at the death of the body enters into some other living thing, then coming to birth, and after passing through all creatures of land, sea, and air, it enters once more into a human body at birth, a cycle which it completes in 3000 years. There are Greeks who have used this doctrine, some earlier and some later, as if it were their own. I know their names, but do not record them. They said that Egypt, until the time of King Ramsinitus, was altogether well governed and prospered greatly, but that Cheops, who was the next king, brought the people to utter misery. For first he closed all the temples, so that no one could sacrifice there, and next he compelled all the Egyptians to work for him. To some he assigned the task of dragging stones from the quarries in the Arabian mountains to the Nile, and after the stones were ferried across the river in boats, he organised others to receive and drag them to the mountains called Libyan. They worked in gangs of 100,000 men, each gang for 3 months. For 10 years the people wore themselves out building the road over which the stones were dragged, work which was in my opinion not much lighter at all than the building of the pyramid. For the road is nearly a mile long and 20 yards wide, and elevated at its highest to a height of 16 yards, and it is all of stone polished and carved with figures. The aforesaid 10 years went to the building of this road, and of the underground chambers in the hill where the pyramids stand. These the king meant to be burial places for himself, and surrounded them with water, bringing in a channel from the Nile. The pyramid itself was 20 years in the making. Its base is square, each side 800 feet long, and its height is the same. The whole is of stone polished and most exactly fitted. There is no block of less than 30 feet in length. This pyramid was made like stairs, which some call steps and others tiers. When this its first form was completed, the workmen used short wooden logs as levers to raise the rest of the stones. They heaved up the blocks from the ground on to the first tier of steps. When the stone had been raised, it was set on another lever that stood on the first tier, and the lever again used to lift it from this tier to the next. It may be that there was a new lever on each tier of steps, or perhaps there was only one lever, quite portable, which they carried up to each tier in turn. I leave this uncertain, as both possibilities were mentioned. But this is certain, that the upper part of the pyramid was finished off first, then the next below it, and last of all the base and the lowest part. There are writings on the pyramid in Egyptian characters, indicating how much was spent on radishes and onions and garlic for the workmen, and I am sure that, when he read me the writing, the interpreter said that 1600 talents of silver had been paid. Now, if that is so, how much must have been spent on the iron with which they worked, and the workmen's food and clothing, considering that the time aforesaid was spent in building, while hewing and carrying the stone and digging out the underground parts was, as I suppose, a business of long duration. And so evil a man was Cheops that, needing money, he put his own daughter in a brothel and made her charge a fee, how much they did not say. She did as her father told her, but was disposed to leave a memorial of her own, and asked of each coming to her that he give one stone. And of these stones they said the pyramid was built that stands midmost of the three, over against the Great Pyramid. Each side of it measures 150 feet. The Egyptians said that this Cheops reigned for 50 years. At his death he was succeeded by his brother Kephren, who was in all respects like Cheops. Kephren also built a pyramid, smaller than his brother's. I have measured it myself. It has no underground chambers, nor is it entered like the other by a canal from the Nile, but the river comes in through a built passage and encircles an island in which, they say, Cheops himself lies. This pyramid was built on the same scale as the other, except that it falls 40 feet short of it in height. It stands near the Great Pyramid. The lowest layer of it is of variegated Ethiopian stone. Both of them stand on the same ridge, which is about 100 feet high. Kephren, they said, reigned for 56 years. Thus they reckon that for 106 years Egypt was in great misery, and the temples, so long shut, were never opened. The people hate the memory of these two kings so much that they do not much wish to name them, and call the pyramids after the shepherd Philitis, who then pastured his flocks in this place. The next king of Egypt, they said, was Cheops's son, Mycerinus. Disliking his father's doings, he opened the temples and let the people, ground down to the depth of misery, go to their business and their sacrifices, and he was the most just judge amongst all the kings. This is why he is praised above all the rulers of Egypt, for not only were his judgments just, but Mycerinus would give any who were not satisfied with the judgment a present out of his own estate to compensate him for his loss. Though mild towards his people, and conducting himself as he did, yet he suffered calamities, the first of which was the death of his daughter, the only child of his household. Deeply grieved over this misfortune, he wanted to give her a burial somewhat more sumptuous than ordinary. He therefore made a hollow cow's image of gilded wood, and placed the body of his dead daughter therein. This cow was not buried in the earth, but was to be seen even in my time in the town of Sais, where it stood in a furnished room of the palace. Incense of all kinds is offered daily before it, and a lamp burns by it all through every night. Near this cow, in another chamber, statues of Mycerinus's concubines stand, so the priests of Sais said, and in fact there are about 20 colossal wooden figures there, made like naked women. But except what I was told, I cannot tell who these are. But some tell the following story about the cow and the statues: that Mycerinus conceived a passion for his own daughter, and then had intercourse with her against her will; and they say that afterwards the girl strangled herself for grief, and that he buried her in this cow, but that her mother cut off the hands of the attendants who had betrayed the daughter to her father, and that now their statues are in the same condition as the living women were. But this I believe to be a silly story, especially about the hands of the figures; for in fact we ourselves saw that the hands have fallen off through age, and were lying at their feet even in my day. As for the cow, it is covered with a purple robe, only the head and neck exposed, encrusted with a very thick layer of gold. Between the horns is the golden figure of the sun's orb. It does not stand, but kneels. It is as big as a live cow of great size. This image is carried out of the chamber once every year, whenever the Egyptians mourn the god, whose name I omit in speaking of these matters. Then the cow is brought out into the light, for they say that before she died she asked her father, Mycerinus, that she see the sun once a year. After what happened to his daughter, the following happened next to this king. An oracle came to him from the city of Buto, announcing that he had just 6 years to live, and was to die in the seventh. The king took this badly, and sent back to the oracle a message of reproach, blaming the god that his father and his uncle, though they had shut up the temples, and disregarded the gods, and destroyed men, had lived for a long time, but that he, who was pious, was going to die so soon. But a second oracle came, announcing that for this very reason his life was hastening to a close; he had done what was contrary to fate. Egypt should have been afflicted for 150 years, and the two kings before him knew this, but not he. Hearing this, Mycerinus knew that his doom was fixed. Therefore he had many lamps made, and would light these at nightfall, and drink and enjoy himself, not letting up day or night, roaming to the marsh country and the groves, and wherever he heard of the likeliest places of pleasure. This was his recourse, so that by turning night into day he might make his 6 years into 12, and so prove the oracle false. End of Book 2, Part 6. Book 2, Part 7 of Herodotus's Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Histories, Volume 1, by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, translated by A. D. Godley. Book 2, Part 7, paragraphs 134 to 150. This king, too, left a pyramid, but far smaller than his father's, each side 20 feet short of 300 feet long, square at the base, and as much as half its height of Ethiopian stone. Some Greeks say that it was built by Rhodopis, the courtesan, but they are wrong. Indeed, it is clear to me that they say this without even knowing who Rhodopis was. Otherwise they would never have credited her with the building of a pyramid, on which what I may call an uncountable sum of money was spent. Or that Rhodopis flourished in the reign of Amasis, not of Mycerinus. For very many years later than these kings who left the pyramids came Rhodopis, who was Thracian by birth, and a slave of Iadmon, son of Hephaestopolis the Samian, and a fellow slave of Aesop the story writer. For he was owned by Iadmon too, as the following made crystal clear. When the Delphians, obeying an oracle, issued many proclamations summoning any one who wanted it to accept compensation for the killing of Aesop, no one accepted it except the son of Iadmon's son, another Iadmon. Hence Aesop too was Iadmon's. Rhodopis came to Egypt to work, brought by Xanthes of Samos, but upon her arrival was freed for a lot of money by Charaxus of Mytilene, son of Scamandronymus and brother of Sappho the poetess. Thus Rhodopis lived as a free woman in Egypt, where, as she was very alluring, she acquired a lot of money, sufficient for such a Rhodopis, so to speak, but not for such a pyramid. Seeing that to this day any one who likes can calculate what 1/10 of her worth was, she cannot be credited with great wealth. For Rhodopis desired to leave a memorial of herself in Greece, by having something made which no one else had thought of or dedicated in a temple, and presenting this at Delphi to preserve her memory. So she spent 1/10 of her substance on the manufacture of a great number of iron beef spits, as many as the 10th would pay for, and sent them to Delphi. These lie in a heap to this day, behind the altar set up by the Chians and in front of the shrine itself. The courtesans of Naucratis seem to be peculiarly alluring, for the woman of whom this story is told became so famous that every Greek knew the name of Rhodopis, and later on a certain Archidike was the theme of song throughout Greece, although less celebrated than the other. Charaxus, after giving Rhodopis her freedom, returned to Mytilene. He is bitterly attacked by Sappho in one of her poems. This is enough about Rhodopis. After Mycerinus, the priests said Asukis became king of Egypt. He built the eastern outer court of Hephaestus's temple. This is by far the finest and grandest of all the courts, for while all have carved figures and innumerable felicities of architecture, this court has far more than any. As not much money was in circulation during this king's reign, they told me a law was made for the Egyptians allowing a man to borrow on the security of his father's corpse, and the law also provided that the lender became master of the entire burial vault of the borrower, and that the penalty for one giving this security, should he fail to repay the loan, was that he was not to be buried at his death either in that tomb of his fathers or in any other, nor was he to bury any relative of his there. Furthermore, in his desire to excel all who ruled Egypt before him, this king left a pyramid of brick to commemorate his name, on which is this writing, cut on a stone: "Do not think me less than pyramids of stone, for I excel them as much as Zeus does other gods. For they stuck a pole down into a marsh, and collected what mud clung to the pole, made bricks of it, and thus built me." These were the acts of Asukis. After him reigned a blind man called Anisis, of the town of that name. In his reign Egypt was invaded by Sabacus, king of Ethiopia, and a great army of Ethiopians. The blind man fled to the marshes, and the Ethiopian ruled Egypt for 50 years, during which he distinguished himself for the following. He would never put to death any Egyptian wrongdoer, but sentenced all, according to the severity of their offences, to raise embankments in their native towns. Thus the towns came to stand yet higher than before, for after first being built on embankments, made by the excavators of the canals in the reign of Sesostris, they were yet further raised in the reign of the Ethiopian. Of the towns in Egypt that were raised, in my opinion Bubastis is especially prominent, where there is a temple of Bubastis, a building most worthy of note. Other temples are greater and more costly, but none more pleasing to the eye than this. Bubastis is, in the Greek language, Artemis. Her temple is of this description. Except for the entrance, it stands on an island, for two channels approach it from the Nile without mixing with one another, running as far as the entry way of the temple, the one and the other flowing around it, each 100 feet wide and shaded by trees. The outer court is 60 feet high, adorned with notable figures 10 feet high. The whole circumference of the city commands a view down into the temple in its midst, for the city's level has been raised, but that of the temple has been left as it was from the first, so that it can be seen into from above. A stone wall, cut with figures, runs around it. Within this is a grove of very tall trees, growing around a great shrine, where the image of the goddess is. The temple is a square, each side measuring an eighth of a mile. A road, paved with stone, about 3/8 of a mile long, leads to the entrance, running eastward through the market place towards the temple of Hermes. This road is about 400 feet wide, and bordered by trees reaching to heaven. Such is this temple. Now the departure of the Ethiopian, they said, came about in this way. After seeing in a dream one who stood over him and urged him to gather together all the priests in Egypt and cut them in half, he fled from the country. Seeing this vision, he said, he supposed it to be a manifestation sent to him by the gods, so that he might commit sacrilege, and so be punished by gods or men. He would not, he said, do so, but otherwise, for the time foretold for his rule over Egypt was now fulfilled, after which he was to depart. For when he was still in Ethiopia, the oracles that are consulted by the people of that country told him that he was fated to reign 50 years over Egypt. Seeing that this time was now completed, and that he was troubled by what he saw in his dream, Sabacus departed from Egypt of his own volition. When the Ethiopian left Egypt, the blind man, it is said, was king once more, returning from the marshes where he had lived for 50 years on an island that he built of ashes and earth. For the Egyptians who were to bring him food without the Ethiopian's knowledge were instructed by the king to bring ashes whenever they came, to add to their gift. This island was never discovered before the time of Amirtius. All the kings before him sought it in vain for more than 700 years. The name of it is Elbow, and it is over a mile long, and of an equal breadth. The next king was the priest of Hephaestus, whose name was Sethos. He despised and had no regard for the warrior Egyptians, thinking he would never need them. Besides otherwise dishonouring them, he took away the chosen lands which had been given to them, 12 fields to each man, in the reign of former kings. So when presently King Sennacherib came against Egypt with a great force of Arabians and Assyrians, the warrior Egyptians would not march against him. The priest, in this quandary, went into the temple shrine, and there, before the god's image, bitterly lamented over what he expected to suffer. Sleep came on him while he was lamenting, and it seemed to him the god stood over him and told him to take heart, that he would come to no harm encountering the power of Arabia. I shall send you champions, said the god. So he trusted the vision, and together with those Egyptians who would follow him, camped at Pelusium, where the road comes into Egypt, and none of the warriors would go with him, but only merchants and craftsmen and traders. Their enemies came there too, and during the night were overrun by a horde of field mice that gnawed quivers and bows and the handles of shields, with the result that many were killed fleeing unarmed the next day. And to this day a stone statue of the Egyptian king stands in Hephaestus's temple, with a mouse in his hand, and an inscription to this effect: "Look at me and believe." Thus far went the record given by the Egyptians and their priests. And they showed me that the time from the first king to that priest of Hephaestus, who was the last, covered 341 generations, and that in this time this also had been the number of their kings and of their high priests. Now 300 generations are 10,000 years, 3 generations being equal to 100, and over and above the 300 the remaining 41 cover 1340 years. Thus the whole period is 11,340 years, in all of which time, they said, they had had no king who was a god in human form, nor had there been any such either before or after those years among the rest of the kings of Egypt. 4 times in this period, so they told me, the sun rose contrary to experience; twice he came up where he now goes down, and twice went down where he now comes up. Yet Egypt at these times underwent no change, either in the produce of the river and the land, or in the matter of sickness and death. Hecataeus the historian was once at Thebes, where he made a genealogy for himself that had him descended from a god in the 16th generation. But the priests of Zeus did with him as they also did with me, who had not traced my own lineage. They brought me into the great inner court of the temple, and showed me wooden figures there, which they counted to the total they had already given. For every high priest sets up a statue of himself there during his lifetime. Pointing to these and counting, the priests showed me that each succeeded his father. They went through the whole line of figures, back to the earliest, from that of the man who had most recently died. Thus, when Hecataeus had traced his descent, and claimed that his 16th forefather was a god, the priests too traced a line of descent according to the method of their counting. For they would not be persuaded by him that a man could be descended from a god. They traced descent through the whole line of 345 figures, not connecting it with any ancestral god or hero, but declaring each figure to be a Pyromis, the son of a Pyromis, in Greek, one who is in all respects a good man. Thus they showed that all those whose statues stood there had been good men, but quite unlike gods. Before these men, they said, the rulers of Egypt were gods, but none had been contemporary with the human priests. Of these gods one or another had in succession been supreme. The last of them to rule the country was Osiris's son Horus, whom the Greeks call Apollo. He deposed Typhon, and was the last divine king of Egypt. Osiris is, in the Greek language, Dionysus. Among the Greeks, Heracles, Dionysus, and Pan are held to be the youngest of the gods. But in Egypt Pan is the most ancient of these, and is one of the 8 gods who are said to be the earliest of all. Heracles belongs to the 2nd dynasty, that of the so-called 12 gods, and Dionysus to the 3rd, which came after the 12. How many years there were between Heracles and the reign of Amasis I have already shown. Pan is said to be earlier still. The years between Dionysus and Amasis are the fewest, and they are reckoned by the Egyptians at 15,000. The Egyptians claim to be sure of all this, since they have reckoned the years and chronicled them in writing. Now the Dionysus, who was called the son of Semele, daughter of Cadmus, was about 1600 years before my time, and Heracles, son of Alcmene, about 900 years, and Pan, the son of Penelope, for according to the Greeks Penelope and Hermes were the parents of Pan, was about 800 years before me, and thus of a later date than the Trojan War. With regard to these two, Pan and Dionysus, one may follow whatever story one thinks most credible, but I give my own opinion concerning them here. Had Dionysus, son of Semele, and Pan, son of Penelope, appeared in Hellas and lived there to old age, like Heracles, the son of Amphitryon, it might have been said that they too, like Heracles, were but men, named after the older Pan and Dionysus, the gods of antiquity. But as it is, the Greek story has it that no sooner was Dionysus born than Zeus sewed him up in his thigh and carried him away to Nysa in Ethiopia, beyond Egypt. And as for Pan, the Greeks do not know what became of him after his birth. It is therefore plain to me that the Greeks learnt the names of these two gods later than the names of all the others, and traced the birth of both to the time when they gained the knowledge. So far I have recorded what the Egyptians themselves say. I shall now relate what is recorded alike by Egyptians and foreigners, and shall add something of what I myself have seen. After the reign of the priest of Hephaestus, the Egyptians were made free, but they could never live without a king, so they divided Egypt into 12 districts and set up 12 kings. These kings intermarried and agreed to be close friends, no one deposing another or seeking to possess more than another. The reason for this agreement, which they scrupulously kept, was this. No sooner were they established in their districts than an oracle was given them that whichever of them poured a libation from a bronze vessel in the temple of Hephaestus, where, as in all the temples, they used to assemble, would be king of all Egypt. Moreover, they decided to preserve the memory of their names by a common memorial, and so they made a labyrinth, a little way beyond Lake Moeris, and near the place called the City of Crocodiles. I have seen it myself, and indeed words cannot describe it. If one were to collect the walls and evidence of other efforts of the Greeks, the sum would not amount to the labour and cost of this labyrinth. And yet the temple at Ephesus and the one on Samos are noteworthy. Though the pyramids beg a description, and each one of them is a match for many great monuments built by Greeks, this maze surpasses even the pyramids. It has 12 roofed courts with doors facing each other, 6 face north and 6 south, in 2 continuous lines, all within one outer wall. There are also double sets of chambers, 3000 altogether, 1500 above and the same number underground. We ourselves viewed those that are above ground, and speak of what we have seen, but we learnt through conversation about the underground chambers. The Egyptian caretakers would by no means show them, as they were, they said, the burial vaults of the kings who first built this labyrinth, and of the sacred crocodiles. Thus we can only speak from hearsay of the lower chambers. The upper we saw for ourselves, and they are creations greater than human. The exits of the chambers and the mazy passages hither and thither through the courts were an unending marvel to us as we passed from court to apartment and from apartment to colonnade, from colonnades again to more chambers and then into yet more courts. Over all this is a roof, made of stone like the walls, and the walls are covered with cut figures, and every court is set around with pillars of white stone very precisely fitted together. Near the corner where the labyrinth ends stands a pyramid 240 feet high, on which great figures are cut. A passage to this has been made underground. Such is this labyrinth, and still more marvellous is Lake Moeris, on which it stands. This lake has a circumference of 450 miles, or 60 skini, as much as the whole seaboard of Egypt. Its length is from north to south. The deepest part has a depth of 50 fathoms. That it has been dug out and made by men's hands, the lake shows for itself, for almost in the middle of it stand 2 pyramids, so built that 50 fathoms of each are below and 50 above the water. Atop each is a colossal stone figure seated on a throne. Thus these pyramids are 100 fathoms high, and 100 fathoms equal a furlong of 600 feet, the fathom measuring 6 feet or 4 cubits, the foot 4 spans, and the cubit 6 spans. The water of the lake is not natural, for the country here is exceedingly arid, but brought by a channel from the Nile. 6 months it flows into the lake, and 6 back into the river. For the 6 months that it flows out of the lake, the daily take of fish brings a silver talent into the royal treasury, and 20 minae for each day of the flow into the lake. Furthermore, the natives said that this lake drains underground into the Libyan Syrtis, and extends under the mountains that are above Memphis, having the inland country on its west. When I could not see anywhere the earth taken from the digging of this lake, since this was curious to me, I asked those who lived nearest the lake where the stuff was that had been dug out. They told me where it had been carried, and I readily believed them, for I had heard of a similar thing happening in the Assyrian city of Ninus. Sardanapalus, king of Ninus, had great wealth, which he kept in an underground treasury. Some thieves plotted to carry it off. They surveyed their course and dug an underground passage from their own house to the palace, carrying the earth taken out of the passage dug by night to the Tigris, which runs past Ninus, until at last they accomplished their end. This, I was told, had happened when the Egyptian lake was dug, except that the work went on not by night but by day. The Egyptians bore the earth dug out by them to the Nile, to be caught and scattered, as was to be expected, by the river. Thus is this lake said to have been dug. End of Book 2, Part 7. Book 2, Part 8 of Herodotus's Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Histories, Volume 1, by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, translated by A. D. Godley. Book 2, Part 8, paragraphs 151 to 182. Now the 12 kings were just, and in time came to sacrifice in Hephaestus's temple. On the last day of the feast, as they were about to pour libations, the high priest brought out the golden vessels which they commonly used for this. But he counted wrongly, and had only 11 for the 12. So the last in line, Psammetichus, as he had no vessel, took off his bronze helmet, and held it out, and poured the libation with it. All the kings were accustomed to wear helmets, and were then helmeted. It was not in guile, then, that Psammetichus held out his headgear, but the rest perceived what Psammetichus had done, and remembered the oracle that promised the sovereignty of all Egypt to whoever poured a libation from a vessel of bronze. Therefore, though they considered Psammetichus not deserving of death, for they examined him and found that he had acted without intent, they decided to strip him of most of his power, and to chase him away into the marshes, and that he was not to concern himself with the rest of Egypt. This Psammetichus had formerly been an exile in Syria, where he had fled from Sabacos the Ethiopian, who killed his father Necos. Then, when the Ethiopian departed because of what he saw in a dream, the Egyptians of the district of Sais brought him back from Syria. Psammetichus was king for the second time when he found himself driven away into the marshes by the 11 kings because of the helmet. Believing, therefore, that he had been abused by them, he meant to be avenged on those who had expelled him. He sent to inquire in the town of Buto where the most infallible oracle in Egypt is. The oracle answered that he would have vengeance when he saw men of bronze coming from the sea. Psammetichus did not in the least believe that men of bronze would come to aid him. But after a short time Ionians and Carians, voyaging for plunder, were forced to put in on the coast of Egypt, where they disembarked in their armour of bronze. And an Egyptian came into the marsh country and brought news to Psammetichus, for he had never before seen armoured men, that men of bronze had come from the sea and were foraging in the plain. Psammetichus saw in this the fulfilment of the oracle. He made friends with the Ionians and Carians, and promised them great rewards if they would join him, and, having won them over, deposed the 11 kings with these allies and those Egyptians who volunteered. Having made himself master of all Egypt, he made the southern outer court of Hephaestus's temple at Memphis, and built facing this a court for Apis, where Apis is kept and fed whenever he appears. This court has an inner colonnade all around it and many cut figures. The roof is held up by great statues 20 feet high for pillars. Apis in Greek is Epaphus. To the Ionians and Carians who helped him, Psammetichus gave places to live in called the camps, opposite each other on either side of the Nile. And besides this, he paid them all that he had promised. Moreover, he put Egyptian boys in their hands to be taught Greek, and from these, who learnt the language, are descended the present day Egyptian interpreters. The Ionians and Carians lived for a long time in these places, which are near the sea, on the arm of the Nile called the Pelusian, a little way below the town of Bubastis. Long afterwards King Amasis removed them and settled them at Memphis to be his guard against the Egyptians. It is a result of our communication with these settlers in Egypt, the first of foreign speech to settle in that country, that we Greeks have exact knowledge of the history of Egypt from the reign of Psammetichus onwards. There still remained in my day, in the places out of which the Ionians and Carians were turned, the winches for their ships and the ruins of their houses. This is how Psammetichus got Egypt. I have often mentioned the Egyptian oracle, and shall give an account of this, as it deserves. This oracle is sacred to Leto, and is situated in a great city by the Sebennytic arm of the Nile, on the way up from the sea. Buto is the name of the city where this oracle is. I have already mentioned it. In Buto there is a temple of Apollo and Artemis. The shrine of Leto, where the oracle is itself very great, and its outer court is 60 feet high. But what caused me the most wonder among the things apparent there I shall mention. In this precinct is the shrine of Leto, the height and length of whose walls is all made of a single stone slab. Each wall has an equal length and height, namely 70 feet. Another slab makes the surface of the roof, the cornice of which is 7 feet broad. Thus, then, the shrine is the most marvellous of all the things that I saw in this temple, but of things of second rank the most wondrous is the island called Chemis. This lies in a deep and wide lake near the temple at Buto, and the Egyptians say that it floats. I never saw it float or move at all, and I thought it a marvellous tale that an island should truly float. However that may be, there is a great shrine of Apollo on it, and 3 altars stand there. Many palm trees grow on the island, and other trees too, some yielding fruit and some not. This is the story that the Egyptians tell to explain why the island moves. That on this island, that did not move before, Leto, one of the 8 gods who first came to be, who was living at Buto, where this oracle of hers is, taking charge of Apollo from Isis, hid him for safety in this island, which is now said to float, when Typhon came hunting through the world, keen to find the son of Osiris. Apollo and Artemis were, they say, children of Dionysus and Isis, and Leto was made their nurse and preserver. In Egyptian Apollo is Horus, Demeter Isis, Artemis Bubastis. It was from this legend, and no other, that Aeschylus, son of Euphorion, took a notion which is in no poet before him, that Artemis was the daughter of Demeter. For this reason the island was made to float. So they say. Psammetichus ruled Egypt for 53 years, 29 of which he spent before Azotus, a great city in Syria, besieging it until he took it. Azotus held out against a siege longer than any city of which we know. Psammetichus had a son, Necos, who became king of Egypt. It was he who began building the canal into the Red Sea, which was finished by Darius the Persian. This is 4 days' voyage in length, and it was dug wide enough for 2 triremes to move in it, rowed abreast. It is fed by the Nile, and is carried from a little above Bubastis by the Arabian town of Patumus. it issues into the Red Sea. Digging began in the part of the Egyptian plain nearest to Arabia. The mountains that extend to Memphis, the mountains where the stone quarries are, come close to this plain. The canal is led along the foothills of these mountains in a long reach from west to east. Passing then into a ravine, it bears southward out of the hill country towards the Arabian Gulf. Now the shortest and most direct passage from the northern to the southern or Red Sea is from the Cassian promontory, the boundary between Egypt and Syria, to the Arabian Gulf, and this is a distance of 125 miles, neither more nor less. This is the most direct route, but the canal is far longer, inasmuch as it is more crooked. In Necos's reign 120,000 Egyptians died digging it. Necos stopped work, stayed by a prophetic utterance that he was toiling beforehand for the barbarian. The Egyptians call all men of other languages barbarians. Necos, then, stopped work on the canal and engaged in preparations for war. Some of his ships of war were built on the northern sea, and some in the Arabian Gulf by the Red Sea coast. The winches for landing these can still be seen. He used these ships when needed, and with his land army met and defeated the Syrians at Magdolus, taking the great Syrian city of Caditis after the battle. He sent to Branchidae of Miletus, and dedicated there to Apollo the garments in which he won these victories. Then he died, after a reign of 16 years, and his son Psamis reigned in his place. While this Psamis was king of Egypt, he was visited by ambassadors from Elis, the Eleans boasting that they had arranged the Olympic games with all the justice and fairness in the world, and claiming that even the Egyptians, although the wisest of all men, could not do better. When the Eleans came to Egypt and announced why they had come, Psamis assembled the Egyptians reputed to be wisest. These assembled and learnt all that the Eleans were to do regarding the games. After explaining this, the Eleans said that they had come to learn whether the Egyptians could discover any juster way. The Egyptians deliberated, and then asked the Eleans if their own citizens took part in the contests. The Eleans answered that they did. All Greeks from Elis or elsewhere might contend. Then the Egyptians said that in establishing this rule they fell short of complete fairness, for there is no way that you will not favour your own townsfolk in the contest, and wrong the stranger. If you wish in fact to make just rules, and have come to Egypt for that reason, you should admit only strangers to the contest, and not Eleans. Such was the counsel of the Egyptians to the Eleans. Psamis reigned over Egypt for only 6 years. He invaded Ethiopia, and immediately thereafter died. And Apries, the son of Psamis, reigned in his place. He was more fortunate than any former king, except his great grandfather Psameticus, during his rule of 25 years, during which he sent an army against Sidon, and fought at sea with the king of Tyre. But when it was fated that evil should overtake him, the cause of it was something that I will now deal with briefly, and at greater length in the Libyan part of this history. Apries sent a great force against Cyrene, and suffered a great defeat. The Egyptians blamed him for this, and rebelled against him, for they thought that Apries had knowingly sent his men to their doom, so that after their perishing in this way he might be the more secure in his rule over the rest of the Egyptians. Bitterly angered by this, those who returned home, and the friends of the slain, openly revolted. Hearing of this, Apries sent Amasis to dissuade them. When Amasis came up with the Egyptians, he exhorted them to desist. But as he spoke, an Egyptian came behind him and put a helmet on his head, saying it was the token of royalty. And Amasis showed that this was not displeasing to him, for after being made king by the rebel Egyptians, he prepared to march against Apries. When Apries heard of it, he sent against Amasis an esteemed Egyptian named Patarbemis, one of his own court, instructing him to take the rebel alive and bring him into his presence. When Patarbemis came and summoned Amasis, Amasis, who was on horseback, rose up and farted, telling the messenger to take that back to Apries. But when in spite of this Patarbemis insisted that Amasis obey the king's summons and go to him, Amasis answered that he had long been preparing to do just that, and Apries would find him above reproach, for he would present himself and bring others. Hearing this, Patarbemis could not mistake Amasis. He saw his preparations and hastened to depart, the more quickly to make known to the king what was going on. When Apries saw him return without Amasis, he did not stop to reflect, but in his rage and fury had Patarbemis's ears and nose cut off. The rest of the Egyptians, who were until now Apries's friends, seeing this outrage done to the man who was most prominent among them, changed sides without delay and offered themselves to Amasis. Learning of this, too, Apries armed his guard and marched against the Egyptians. He had a bodyguard of Carians and Ionians, 30,000 of them, and his royal palace was in the city of Sais, a great and marvellous place. Apries's men marched against the Egyptians, and so did Amasis's men against the foreigners. So they both came to Momemphis and were going to make trial of one another. The Egyptians are divided into 7 classes: priests, warriors, cowherds, swineherds, merchants, interpreters, and pilots. There are this many classes, each named after its occupation. The warriors are divided into Calasiries and Hermotubies, and they belong to the following districts, for all divisions in Egypt are made according to districts. The Hermotubies are from the districts of Busiris, Sais, Chemis, and Papremis, the island called Prosopitis, and half of Natho, from all of these. Their number, at its greatest, attained to 160,000. None of these has learnt any common trade; they are free to follow the profession of arms only. The Calasiries are from the districts of Thebes, Bubastis, Aphthis, Tanis, Mendes, Sebanis, Athribis, Pharbaithis, Thmuis, Onuphis, Anitis, Maekphoris. This last is an island opposite the city of Bubastis. From all these. Their number, at its greatest, attained to 250,000 men. These too may practise no trade but war, which is their hereditary calling. Now, whether this too the Greeks have learnt from the Egyptians, I cannot confidently judge. I know that in Thrace and Scythia, and Persia and Lydia, and nearly all foreign countries, those who learn trades are held in less esteem than the rest of the people, and those who have least to do with artisans' work, especially men who are free to practise the art of war, are highly honoured. This much is certain, that this opinion, which is held by all Greeks, and particularly by the Lacedaemonians, is of foreign origin. It is in Corinth that artisans are held in least contempt. The warriors were the only Egyptians, except the priests, who had special privileges. For each of them an untaxed plot of 12 acres was set apart. This acre is a square of 100 Egyptian cubits each way, the Egyptian cubit being equal to the Samian. These lands were set apart for all. It was never the same men who cultivated them, but each in turn. 1,000 Calasiries and as many Hermotubies were the king's annual bodyguard. These men, besides their lands, each received a daily provision of 5 minae weight of roast grain, 2 minae of beef, and 4 cups of wine. These were the gifts received by each bodyguard. When Apries with his guards, and Amasis with the whole force of Egyptians, came to the town of Momemphis, they engaged, and though the foreigners fought well, they were vastly outnumbered, and therefore were beaten. Apries, they say, supposed that not even a god could depose him from his throne, so firmly did he think he was established. And now, defeated in battle, and taken captive, he was brought to Sais, to the royal dwelling, which belonged to him once, but now belonged to Amasis. There he was kept alive for a while in the palace, and well treated by Amasis. But presently the Egyptians complained that there was no justice in keeping alive one who was their own and their king's bitterest enemy. Whereupon Amasis gave Apries up to them, and they strangled him, and then buried him in the burial place of his fathers. This is in the temple of Athena, very near to the sanctuary, on the left of the entrance. The people of Sais buried within the temple precinct all kings who were natives of their district. The tomb of Amasis is farther from the sanctuary than the tomb of Apries and his ancestors, yet it, too, is within the temple court. It is a great colonnade of stone, richly adorned, the pillars made in the form of palm trees. In this colonnade are two portals, and the place where the coffin lies is within their doors. There is also at Sais the burial place of one whose name I think it impious to mention in speaking of such a matter. It is the temple of Athena, behind and close to the length of the wall of the shrine. Moreover, great stone obelisks stand in the precinct, and there is a lake near by, adorned with a stone margin, and made in a complete circle. It is, as it seemed to me, the size of the lake at Delos, which they call the Round Pond. On this lake they enact by night the story of the gods' sufferings, a rite which the Egyptians call the Mysteries. I could say more about this, for I know the truth, but let me preserve a discreet silence. Let me preserve a discreet silence, too, concerning the rite of Demeter, which the Greeks call Thesmophoria, except as much of it as I am not forbidden to mention. The daughters of Danaus were those who brought this rite out of Egypt and taught it to the Pelasgian women. Afterwards, when the people of the Peloponnese were driven out by the Dorians, it was lost, except in so far as it was preserved by the Arcadians, the Peloponnesian people which was not driven out but left in its home. After Apries was deposed, Amasis became king. He was from a town called Siuf, in the district of Sais. Now at first he was scorned, and held in low regard by the Egyptians, on the ground that he was a common man, and of no high family. But presently he won them over by being shrewd and not arrogant. He had among his countless treasures a golden washbowl, in which he and all those who ate with him were accustomed to clean their feet. This he broke in pieces, and out of it made a god's image, which he set in a most conspicuous spot in the city, and the Egyptians came frequently to this image, and held it in great reverence. When Amasis learnt what the townfolk were doing, he called the Egyptians together, and told them that the image had been made out of the washbowl, in which the Egyptians had once vomited and urinated and cleaned their feet, but which now they greatly revered. Now then, he said, I have fared like the washbowl, since if before I was a common man, still I am your king now. And he told them to honour and show respect for him. The following was how he scheduled his affairs. In the morning, until the hour when the market place filled, he readily conducted whatever business was brought to him. The rest of the day he drank and joked at the expense of his companions, and was idle and playful. But this displeased his friends, who admonished him thus: O king, you do not conduct yourself well by indulging too much in vulgarity. You, a celebrated man, ought to conduct your business throughout the day, sitting on a celebrated throne, and thus the Egyptians would know that they are governed by a great man, and you would be better spoken of. As it is, what you do is by no means kingly. But he answered them like this: Men that have bows string them when they must use them, and unstring them when they have used them. Were bows kept strung for ever, they would break, and so could not be used when needed. Such, too, is the nature of man. Were one to be always at serious work, and not permit oneself a bit of relaxation, he would go mad or idiotic before he knew it. I am well aware of that, and give each of the two its turn. Such was his answer to his friends. It is said that even when Amasis was a private man he was fond of drinking and joking, and was not at all a sober man, and that when his drinking and pleasure seeking cost him the bare necessities, he would go around stealing. Then, when he contradicted those who said that he had their possessions, they would bring him to whatever place of divination was near by, and sometimes the oracles declared him guilty, and sometimes they acquitted him. When he became king, he did not take care of the shrines of the gods who had acquitted him of theft, or give them anything for maintenance, or make it his practice to sacrifice there, for he knew them to be worthless and their oracles false. But he took scrupulous care of the gods who had declared his guilt, considering them to be gods in very deed, and their oracles infallible. Amasis made a marvellous outer court for the temple of Athena at Sais, far surpassing all in its height and size, and in the size and quality of the stone blocks. Moreover, he set up huge images and vast man headed sphinxes, and brought enormous blocks of stone besides for the building. Some of these he brought from the stone quarries of Memphis. The largest came from the city of Elephantine, 20 days' journey distant by river from Sais. But what I admire most of his works is this. He brought from Elephantine a shrine made of one single block of stone. Its transport took 3 years, and 2000 men had the carriage of it, all of them pilots. This chamber is 35 feet long, 23 feet wide, 13 feet high. These are the external dimensions of the chamber, which is made of one block. Its internal dimensions are 31 feet long, 20 feet wide, 8 feet high. It stands at the entrance of the temple. It was not dragged within, so they say, because, while it was being drawn, the chief builder complained aloud of the great expense of time and his loathing of the work, and Amasis, taking this to heart, would not let it be drawn further. Some also say that a man, one of those who heaved up the shrine, was crushed by it, and therefore it was not dragged within. Furthermore, Amasis dedicated, beside monuments of marvellous size in all the other temples of note, the huge image that lies supine before Hephaestus's temple at Memphis. This image is 75 feet in length. There stand on the same base, on either side of the great image, two huge statues hewn from the same block, each of them 20 feet high. There is at Sais another stone figure of the like size, supine, as is the figure at Memphis. It was Amasis, too, who built the great and most marvellous temple of Isis at Memphis. It is said that in the reign of Amasis Egypt attained to its greatest prosperity, in respect of what the river did for the land and the land for its people, and that the number of inhabited cities in the country was 20,000. It was Amasis also who made the law that every Egyptian declare his means of livelihood to the ruler of his district annually, and that omitting to do so, or to prove that one had a legitimate livelihood, be punishable with death. Solon the Athenian got this law from Egypt, and established it among his people. May they always have it, for it is a perfect law. Amasis became a Philhellene, and besides other services which he did for some of the Greeks, he gave those who came to Egypt the city of Naucratis to live in, and to those who travelled to the country without wanting to settle there, he gave lands where they might set up altars and make holy places for their gods. Of these the greatest and most famous and most visited precinct is that which is called the Hellenion, founded jointly by the Ionian cities of Chios, Tios, Phocaea, and Clazomenae, the Dorian cities of Rhodes, Cnidus, Halicarnassus, and Pharselis, and one Aeolian city, Mytilene. It is to these that the precinct belongs, and these are the cities that furnish overseers of the trading port. If any other cities advance claims, they claim what does not belong to them. The Aeginetans made a precinct of their own, sacred to Zeus, and so did the Samians for Hera, and the Milesians for Apollo. Naucratis was in the past the only trading port in Egypt. Whoever came to any other mouth of the Nile had to swear that he had not come intentionally, and had then to take his ship and sail to the Canobic mouth; or if he could not sail against contrary winds, he had to carry his cargo in barges around the delta until he came to Naucratis. In such esteem was now Crates held. When the Amphictyons paid 300 talents to have the temple that now stands at Delphi finished, as that which was formerly there burnt down by accident, it was the Delphians' lot to pay a fourth of the cost. They went about from city to city collecting gifts, and got most from Egypt, for Amasis gave them 1,000 talents weight of astringent earth, and the Greek settlers in Egypt 20 minae. Amasis made friends and allies of the people of Cyrene, and he decided to marry from there, either because he had his heart set on a Greek wife, or for the sake of the Corcyraeans' friendship. In any case he married a certain Ladike, said by some to be the daughter of Battus, of Arcesilaus by others, and by others again of Critobulus, an esteemed citizen of the place. But whenever Amasis lay with her, he became unable to have intercourse, though he managed with every other woman. And when this happened repeatedly, Amasis said to the woman called Ladike, Woman, you have cast a spell on me, and there is no way that you shall avoid perishing the most wretchedly of all women. So Ladike, when the king did not relent at all, although she denied it, vowed in her heart to Aphrodite that if Amasis could have intercourse with her that night, since that would remedy the problem, she would send a statue to Cyrene to her. And after the prayer immediately Amasis did have intercourse with her. And whenever Amasis came to her thereafter, he had intercourse, and he was very fond of her after this. Ladike paid her vow to the goddess. She had an image made, and sent it to Cyrene, where it stood safe until my time, facing outside the city. Cambyses, when he had conquered Egypt and learnt who Ladike was, sent her away to Cyrene unharmed. Moreover, Amasis dedicated offerings in Hellas. He gave to Cyrene a gilt image of Athena and a painted picture of himself; to Athena of Lindus 2 stone images and a marvellous linen breastplate; and to Hera in Samos 2 wooden statues of himself that were still standing in my time behind the doors in the great shrine. The offerings in Samos were dedicated because of the friendship between Amasis and Polycrates, son of Iarches. What he gave to Lindus was not out of friendship for any one, but because the temple of Athena in Lindus is said to have been founded by the daughters of Danaus when they landed there in their flight from the sons of Aegyptus. Such were Amasis's offerings. Moreover, he was the first conqueror of Cyprus, which he made tributary to himself. End of Book 2.